Hello guys, today we're going to talk about asynchronous JavaScript. We can say that asynchronous JavaScript is on every website in nowadays, but maybe you have written somewhere else async code to fetch some data, but maybe you don't know what was asynchronous at the time. And for very short definition, asynchronous code is perform action now and finish later on, without blocking and other actions. So let's say that, for example, we may use an API such as Facebook API, and we use that to fetch some data. Instead of blocking and waiting the API response, asynchronous JavaScript is keep carry on the next action code until that API response. Then we can do something with that data. But before we talk more about asynchronous code, let's talk a little bit about synchronous code. So, JavaScript is well known runs on a single threaded synchronously, which means can execute only one statement at a time from top to bottom. It handles one task by waiting every single action complete and then can move to the next actions. And now let's take a look at this small example right here that I'm going to use an API which run in function called getData. And this function will fetch some data performed in synchronously, which means waiting data completely response before move to the next action. Again, synchronous code is waiting for an action complete before can jump to the next code line. So it's going to read and wait until completely done, then it's gonna log that into the console. And then it's gonna perform next line, and so on. Well, maybe you think that that's okay, it just run a single line at a time. But what do you think if it performing in the heavy action? So now let's think another scenario. What happens if the file that you read from is large size and take a long period to complete the job? Then the code right here will block the code and it's not going to move to the next line, just keep waiting until the data ready. So we have to wait it in the period. For example, we spend around 30 seconds to read the file, then we have to wait 30 seconds before we can do anything. Okay, so to handle this situation, we use asynchronous code. Now, this is asynchronous example to do the same things. But in this time, we're going to call getData async to fetch some data from API asynchronously. So, what this thing's gonna do? Well, it's gonna run into the separate threads. So, when the JavaScript engine executes this line, it's gonna say, okay, you take this task, go to get data for me. After you get it, just log and show me. Then the thread's gonna carry on and run to the next function. Okay, when the other threads go to grab the data, but it's no longer keep waiting while reading the data. Instead, we can move to the next statement. But we might hear that the JavaScript run in a single thread. And how does it work asynchronously? The JavaScript that we write only run on one thread, but the request async like this are transferred to the separate thread, which run outside the JavaScript runtime. So that JavaScript thread itself, or known as the main threads, can move freely to the next function. So now let's take a look in this for better understand the basic concept between async and synchronous code. Behind the scenes, the code is run from top to bottom. The console.log push into the stack and it's gonna pop out, and then it's print out to the console. And then this JavaScript thread move to the next function, which works as asynchronous. So it's gonna hand off to the web API outside the JavaScript runtime to perform requests to data. So these have the thread move freely to the next functions in meantime. And whenever actions in the web API finished, it will trigger into the stack queue and sending the results through the event loop and fire the callback in the stack that returns some data. And this means JavaScript itself have no idea, but the browser mechanism does for it. And it is the reason JavaScript runs a single thread but can perform asynchronously. So this is the workflow of async code at start now and finish later, and make our code non-blocking because in other functions below async function, they can run while async functions is process the request. And now synchronous JavaScript would work like this. The first console.log fire, then the second one is synchronous request, and waiting until reading data completely done, then it's gonna block the rest of the functions below to be called. And now we know a little bit what asynchronous code does, the concept of asynchronous code, and how JavaScript have a single thread but can perform asynchronously. Now I want to show a super quick demo of this principal concept. So the first things that I'm gonna do is create a very basic HTML page with the JavaScript. Inside that, I'm gonna put the console.log and the middle I'm gonna insert alert methods to show the dialog in the browser. And these code statements will run synchronously. So alert in here is going to interrupt the rest of the code below unless I click the OK button in the dialog. Okay, so let's run it, and we're gonna see that alert pop up in the browser. And then we're going to inspect the element and go to tab console over here. Right now we can see that the console.log have print only hello at the first line, and the other console.log haven't print out. That because the alert dialog blocked the rest of the code. So if I hit that button, it's going to continue execute all the below statements. So this is how synchronous code actually does. And if I change this into the set timeout, and this method allows the JavaScript execute a function after waiting a specific period. So this we have passing the callback function that's gonna be fired after waiting amount of time. Okay, about the callback function, we're gonna talk it later on. And we will fire this function in the 3 seconds. So we're gonna pass the 3000 as a milliseconds. And now imagine that the setTimeout functions works as asynchronous network request that gonna take 3 seconds to get the data. And when it takes the data back, it's gonna fire this callback functions over here. Just say that so it doesn't keep blocking the rest of the code below. And I will show you that. Just save it and refresh the browser. We see that hello 1 and 2. Then after the 3 seconds, we see this callback is called. If you think what I have explained before, then the JavaScript would execute this line and waiting the 3 seconds outside the JavaScript or in web API. Then it's gonna fire this and this. And after the timeout reached, the callback functions fired, and this does not block the code. And in the next video, instead of using setTimeout, we're gonna use HTTP request for getting the data. So now we know the general idea of the asynchronous code and synchronous code. For the next, I will show how we are able to make a network request for the data.